Assalamu alaikum. I hope you people are safe, sound and blessed and feeling a bit lighter too. Half of this semester is over. This is our first lecture after your midterm and I must congratulate you. You people did really very well, hard work and getting used to this, not only these difficult times but in a way, this different way of meeting each other. And let me tell you again and again that I miss you in person. I know I'm talking to you, but I miss my class. I miss that very much, the classroom and all of you sitting right in front of me. When in the last week, I mean before the midterm week, we were talking about the civil rights, and we need to talk about how these civil rights gave rise to power among the Afro-Americans, the black power of America. Eisenhower was the president, and when he took the office, Supreme Court was slated to rehear a legal challenge to racially segregated school system spearheaded and its legal strategist, Thurgood Marshall. And you know, the Marshall is a big name in American justice system. This legal question about segregated schools, which means different schools for blacks and different schools for whites, and this Warren wrote the court's unanimous opinion in Brown W. Board of Education, Topeka, which declared that legally enforced segregation of public school violated the constitutional right of African American students to equal protection of law. Although it technically applied only to educational facilities, Brown implied that all segregated public facilities, not simply schools, were open to legal challenge. And this was a big landmark in ascertaining the socio-legal status of black Americans. And during 1950s, the South was becoming more like the rest of the country. If you remember, we have been talking about South lagging behind than the North, and almost very much black and very much backward. New cultural forces such as network television were linking the South more closely with a nationally based culture. Economic forces were also at work. Machines were replacing the region's predominantly black field workers, and the absence of strong labor unions and the presence of favorable tax laws were attracting national chain stores, business franchise, and northern-based industries to the South. And at the same time, the racial composition of cities in the West, Midwest, and Northeast was becoming more like that of South in 1940. More than three-quarters of the nation's Afro-Americans lived in the South. Accelerating the pattern began during the Second World War. African Americans left the rural South and settled in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Cleveland, and other big cities. And during the late 1940s and early 50s, in the mid-1950s, this demographic shift was accompanied white flight to the new suburbs and by significant changes in political alignments, with African American voters becoming increasingly important in the North. For example, urban Democrats came to support the drive to end radical discrimination. So black power was basically changing the profile of politics in America. The Republicans were making small electoral gains in what had long been the Democratic Party's solid South. Most important, African Americans themselves mounted a new attack on segregation and racial discrimination in the South. The battle against racial discrimination was coming to dominate domestic politics. Segregationists in the South pledged massive resistance to the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. And this always happens when powerful are losing. They do not like it. Defiance went beyond the courtroom. Vigilants unfurled the banners and donned the white robes of the Ku Klux Klan, which was joined by new racist organizations such as the White Citizen Council. As a result, anti-discrimination activists constantly risked injury and death, and even people only indirectly connected to the struggle fell victim to racist violence. In August 1955, two white Mississippians murdered 14-year-old Emmett Till, a visitor from Chicago, for acting disrespectful to a white woman. Mamie Till Bradley demanded that her son's murder not remain a private incident. She insisted that his maimed corpse be displayed publicly for the whole world to see, and the young Till's killers be punished. This was a very strong voice. When their case came to trial, an all-white jury found the killers, who would subsequently confess their part in the murder, not guilty. So in response to the uncertainty of these judicial remedies, African Americans began supplementing legal maneuvering with aggressive campaign direct action. In Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, a member of the local NAACP, was arrested in 1955 for refusing to obey a state segregation law that required black passengers to give up their seats to whites and sit at the back of the bus. Montgomery's black community, which had a long history of civil rights activism, responded to her arrest by boycotting public transportation and by organizing a system of private carpools as alternative transit. The resulting financial losses convinced the city's public transit system to reconsider its segregation, its policy. Joining with Rosa Parks, many African American women spearheaded the bus boycott. The Montgomery boycott during 1955 and 1956 thus resulted in the desegregation of city buses and demonstrated to other black communities in the South that they could mobilize against acts of overt discrimination. This was that the African Americans were coming to have some power in their social status. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., one of its leaders of this Montgomery boycott, into the national spotlight. He was brought in, born, raised, and educated in Atlanta with a doctorate in theology from Boston University. King followed up the victory in Montgomery by joining with other black ministers to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In addition to pressing for the desegregation of public facilities, they launched an effort to register African American voters throughout the South. More activist than the NAACP, the King's broad vision of social change integrated forced by passive civil disobedience throughout the nation. The purpose of civil disobedience, according to King, was to persuade people through both words and deeds of the moral evil of segregation and racial discrimination. The ultimate goal of the civil rights crusade was to bring redemption and reconciliation to American society, aided by the national media, especially network television. King's powerful presence and religiously rooted rhetoric carried the message of the anti-discrimination movement in the South to the entire nation. Political institutions in Washington responded very slowly. The Supreme Court expanded its definition of civil rights but generally backed away from mandating the sweeping institutional changes needed to make these rights meaningful. We have talked about the civil rights in the last lecture, but let's have a little more about it. Congress, meanwhile, remained deeply divided on racial issues, with Southern segregationists, all of them members of the Democratic majority, holding key posts on Capitol Hill. Anti-discrimination legislation faced formidable obstacles. President Eisenhower appeared largely indifferent to the issue of racial discrimination when liberal Republicans urged him to take action, perhaps through an executive order barring racial discrimination on construction projects financed by federal funds. Eisenhower did nothing. A gradualist on racial issues, he regarded the fight against discrimination as primarily a local matter, and publicly doubted that any federal civil rights legislation could change the attitude of people opposed to the integration of public facilities on job sites. In 1957, Eisenhower was forced to act. The segregationist governor of Arkansas, Orville Forbes, ordered his state's National Guard to block enforcement of a federal court order mandating integration of Little Rock Central High School. Responding to this direct challenge to national authority, Eisenhower put the Arkansas National Guard under federal control and augmented it with members of the U.S. Army. Oh, this was a great victory. Black students escorted by armed troops could then enter the high school. Whenever you need an extra support, no doubt wherever it is, in which country, the army will always solve the problem. Thank you.